Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, a word about Wondrium, our sponsor of the show. It's an app on the phone, obviously, or you can access it on your laptop. And this one just popped up today. It is called The Triumph of Christianity. None other than Professor Bart Ehrman. Been on the show twice. He's coming on again soon. The subtitle of the course is From Jesus of Nazareth to the Holy Roman Empire, Explore the Rise of Christianity. So I just touch on this, and here's a list of the different lectures. There are 24 30-minute lectures. For example, the Christian conquest of Rome, pagan religions in the Roman world, Judaism in the Roman world, Christianity in the Roman world, the life and teachings of Jesus, the beginning of Christianity, the early Christian missions, the conversion of Paul, and so on, all the way to the beginning of a Christian Roman Empire and the triumph of Christianity. I read Bart's book on this, and that's what he was on the show for. So I'm going to listen to this series of lectures. So here's the deal with Wondrium. It's a subscription service. You can get a free 1-month trial by subscribing through the show. So you go to wondrium.com/Shermer. So it's wondrium.com/Shermer to get your free 1-month trial. The beauty of this is you have, instead of like purchasing or renting a single course, which is how it used to work with the great courses teaching company, now with Wondrium, you can just subscribe. You have access to hundreds of courses and therefore thousands of lectures, and you can just bounce around and try different things, which is really great because some courses are more interesting than others, depending on what you're interested in at the time. So give that a try. Again, it's wondrium.com/Shermer. All right, here comes our guest. Thanks for listening. My guest today is the legendary psychologist Richard Nisbett. His book is Thinking. It's a memoir. It's really more of an intellectual autobiography that is the kind of tracing his pathway in his career of the different subjects in human psychology he's interested in researching. And he pioneered many of the great topics that have been explored by social psychologists in particular. Richard is the Theodore M. Newcomb Distinguished University Professor of Psychology Emeritus at the University of Michigan. He also taught psychology at Columbia University and at Yale University. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science and the National Academy of Science, and he was a John Simon Guggenheim Fellow. He received the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award from the American Psychological Association and the Gold Medal Award for Lifetime Mentorship from the Association for Psychological Science. Most of his work has focused on social psychology and cognitive psychology. His book, The Geography of Thought, How Asians and Westerners Think Differently and Why, won the William James Book Award of the American Psychological Association. Okay, so we talk about how lives turn out. What's the relative roles of genes and environment, parents, peer groups, mentors, culture, and so forth, and how a experimental psychologist like him thinks about those things. We talk about race and IQ, that very controversial subject, and he shows pretty definitively that the genetic explanation for group differences in IQ is wrong, and wrong. And he makes a really good case for how we know that it's environment, particularly these either enriched environments or impoverished environments of early childhood, and what a huge difference those make. We talk about some of the most famous experiments in psychology, including by Phil Zimbardo and his Stanford Prison experiment, which Nisbett is very skeptical of, and then Stanley Milgram's shock experiments, of which he's not skeptical of, and he shows how definitive those were. We talk about what it takes to make a Nazi, that is to say, from a social psychologist's point of view. How do you explain that educated, intelligent, cultured people like Germans become Nazis? Okay, we show how that probably happened, and then how we can apply that to our own issues of where racism and discrimination still happens in the United States. Richard is one of the pioneers of studying the cultural differences between people, particularly Northerners versus Southerners here in the United States, why there are homicide differences, the culture of honor in the South, and how that leads to more violence, and what we can do about that. He is the guy that pioneered that. And anyway, then we talk about some policy issues, what we can do about these particular problems we still face, what the government should do, what you and I should do, what institutions and organizations can do. And then he reflects at the end on some of his research. He's still continuing at age 80. He's still quite active researching and writing, and how he wants to look at some more of these cultural differences internationally and how that affects life here in the United States. So that should be pretty interesting. At any rate, if you appreciate the podcast, please do support it. That's skeptic.com/donate. That's the organization, Skeptic Society, that I direct under the umbrella of which is this podcast. So to support it, because it's free for everybody on all platforms, that you can just make a donation at skeptic.com/donate, and we'd really appreciate your support. All right, thanks for listening. All right, Richard, let's start. Richard Nisbett, your new book is called Thinking, a Memoir. I will have already introduced the book in the intro video, but let me just say what a great honor it is to have you on the show. You are a legend in experimental and social psychology. I read your works when I was an undergraduate in the early 70s, and then a graduate student in the mid to late 70s. And then, of course, when I returned to writing about psychology in the 2000s, you were even more legendary. So what a great honor it is to actually be sitting in front of the actual legend himself. So you've written this memoir, and yeah, you're welcome. So let's just start with just kind of a general reflection. When you think about all the things you've studied about motivated reasoning and cognitive biases and things like the self-serving bias and the self-justification bias and the hindsight bias and so on, how do you apply that when you write a memoir, an autobiography? That is, you look back on your life, you're going to be biased in how you see the through line and find some causal connections from one event to another, and you kind of try to tie them all in at the end when you look back. But to what extent was it kind of random and contingent along the pathway?
Well, the first surprise in writing a memoir was to realize that you're not going to be telling the whole truth. You tell the truth for sure, but I mean, it's so selective. I mean, I long ago realized that you can interview somebody and you can make them look like an absolute monster if you want to, or you can make them look like a saint. So I tried to avoid both of those and just telling the truth. So that was a surprise to realize that you can't just push a button and let everything come out. It has to, it's done on a various number of biases. So that was the first discovery. The other thing is realizing that you try to tell a story that makes causal sense. For example, I claim in there that a lot of my research is understandable given my earlier life. But you can't really know that. I mean, I have an experience, and a little later in life, I do some research, and I may tie it back. I may have thoughts about that, but you don't know what the causal sequence is, or even the causal actuality. So that was another interesting discovery about writing, is that there's a certain amount of confabulation that goes on. And of course, that's a big part of my career, is talking about how much of what we say to one another into ourselves is confabulation.
Yeah, I mean, your most famous paper is called, one of your most famous papers is Telling More Than We Know, Verbal Reports on Mental Processes, that you published in 1977, in which you write about how introspective reports can provide only an account of what people think about how they think, but not how they really think. So you must have kind of faced this yourself, like, hey, I wonder if this applies to me when I'm writing about my own life. So, Richard, you're 80 years old now. I also want to ask you one of these 30,000 feet questions on the world. You know, you've studied rationality and irrationality and all the crazy beliefs that people hold and why we make mistakes and errors in our thinking and so on. You know, we're just right now in the middle of this crazy, sort of post-truth world of fake news, alternative facts, QAnon conspiracy theories, rigged election conspiracy theories. People just believe in all sorts of crazy things. on the right, and then on the left, postmodernism and cultural relativism, and there are no truths. My lived experience is as true as your lived experience, and there is no objective reality or truth to be found, and so on and so on. How do you put today's, not to mention COVID-19, the shutdown, and all the other craziness that we've just gone through in the last 2 years, how do you put now into perspective, say, compared to back in the late 60s and 70s and 80s and all the kind of tumultuous periods we've gone through before?
Well, that was quiescent compared to what we have now. And you put your finger on what most disturbs me about the world we're living in now, is that people think, truth is subjective. There's no out there. It's just in here, there, which is alarming. I mean, I studied the errors that people make. That's a big part of my career. But I never dreamed that we would have such massive systematic error about reality, about the meaning of events that we have now. So it's again, I had us looking like unbiased geniuses compared to what I think we are now.
Yeah, I'm kind of conflicted about this. My magazine is called Skeptic. And we promote science and critical thinking under the assumption that we can influence the way people think and teach them how to think like scientists. And yet, on the other hand, every one of our issues is filled with just crazy stuff that people believe and show how irrational we are. So how do you square that kind of paradox? We seemingly have the capability of being rational, and yet oftentimes we aren't.
Right. Well, I guess I've had a new layer of irrationality added on in the form of the stuff we've been talking about. The errors that I have studied in my career have been relatively benign, although they're serious. I mean, and we're all subject to them. And I never was interested in the lurid errors that people make. I used to say, I'm only interested in the errors of smart people. because those, I mean, we can take care of everybody else later, but if we can just figure out what it is that the smart people are doing wrong, that's a start.
Yeah, the problem, it seems to me, is that to invoke another cognitive bias is the my side bias. It seems to be so much of a team sport. We're reasoning more like lawyers to win our case, our side, defend our beliefs, rather than scientists trying to figure out how the world works. So, and if anything, smart people are even better at this. They're better at rationalizing their beliefs, at researching and finding examples to confirm what they already believe, and then do the opposite to the other side. And it's again, to what extent does somebody actually believe something? I'm not sure. You say they don't have access to their internal thoughts themselves. Perhaps if somebody ticks the box on a survey that says, I think the election was rigged, or, QAnon is real, do they really believe that? Or are they just signaling to their tribe, I'm such a good Republican, I'm going to defend Trump to the bitter end, no matter what the evidence? And their intelligence is kind of beside the point. If anything, it maybe works against them.
Right. This is something I've become extremely interested in. I mean, when I say I believe X, do I believe it? For example, allegedly 33% of the people or so in the country still believe that George Bush knew about 9/11 before it happened. And
oh yes.
I can't believe that a third of the people are stupid enough to believe that. So they just say. And a third of the people still today believe that Obama, would tell you that they believe that Obama was not born in this country. I mean, do they really believe that? I've decided that questions like that are essentially, the real question is, do you hate the President of the United States? and so then anything you say, he eats babies for breakfast. Yeah, that sounds right. Do they believe it? I really don't know. Do they know whether they believe it or not? It's all a mystery to me.
I think that's right. That's how I think about conspiracy theories now, is that they're often proxies for some other belief, a deeper belief. So if I take you to the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria in Washington, D.C. and show you that they don't have a basement, much less a pedophile ring run by Hillary where they're eating babies, it's not like you're going to go, oh, in that case, I'll vote for Hillary, or yeah, I think I'll be a Democrat now. No, you were never going to vote for Hillary, and you hate Democrats. And a pedophile ring, that's just the sort of thing a Democrat would do. Or flip it. That's just the sort of thing George W. Bush would have done. He would have, let it happen on purpose or made it happen on purpose. MyHop and LIHOP are the two configurations of that. And so the details of the conspiracy, like in this case, that the conjunction fallacy, that the planes hit the buildings and explosive devices were used, cannot both be true. Either one of those by themselves independently would be more likely than the two of them together. Therefore, and we all saw the planes hit the buildings, therefore it can't have been explosive devices. We can debunk this through logic. So you don't need to know anything about thermite and super thermite and super secret super thermite that was planted to bring down the buildings and all that. But all that's kind of irrelevant. We publish all this stuff in Skeptic, but people don't care about the details. It's like, I don't like Republicans, or I hate Bush, and therefore that, as you said, that's just the kind of thing he would do. So, that to me frustrates me, because then how do you counter the claim? You can counter it, but people may not change their minds.
Right. Well, you made reference earlier to what is really a new finding for me, and that is, you think, well, the smarter people are, the more rational they are. So if you give them a bunch of evidence against their belief, the smarter you are, the more likely you are to give up your belief. No, the smarter you are, the more likely you are to get around the evidence, to reinterpret it, to come up with new evidence against it. So that's actually maybe the scariest thing I could think of about the human mind now, is that sheer intelligence won't allow you to be fully rational in your response to new information.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the research showing that people that accept climate science and global warming is real and human caused don't actually know much about the science at all, and no more than the people who doubt it, the so-called climate deniers. So really what people are doing is they're signaling, well, I trust science because it's a pretty reliable institution, or I don't trust those scientists when they're all a bunch of libtard left-wingers, and Al Gore started this whole thing, and I don't like him, therefore I doubt it. So the facts of climate science are kind of secondary to what it represents. And how do you get around that? That's a hard one.
Right. No, I think there's an attitude, a stance that some people have where I am very extreme. I'm Mr. Trust the Expert. I mean, somebody tells me something, I want to assess how likely is it this person knows the truth, and what is his or her degree of expertise on this topic, and how much does it exceed mine. So, I feel with something like COVID and vaccinations, I don't have independent opinions. I think only an idiot has an independent opinion. You just said, what are the experts saying? Okay, that's what I believe, because I really, think we have no choice. But this is a stance that I think is completely foreign to many people, if not most people. People. There's I just saw a cartoon of a grave marker. It says, I did my own research.
Yes, I've seen that one. Right. Why are people doing that with this one when they don't do it for 99% of other things in life they just take for granted? Yes. Interesting problem. Well, here.
Now, go ahead.
Yeah, here I was just thinking of one of my favorite quotes from Christopher Hitchens. When you hear the Pope say he believes in God today, you think, well, the Pope's doing his job today. If you hear the Pope saying, I'm having some doubts about God's existence, you think, he might be onto something. So so-called experts, when they go against themselves, then you think, well, they might be onto something. So, I was thinking about the rigged election, and people were saying, oh, skeptics should look into this. It's like, we don't have the resources. The Department of Justice is the organization that does this, or 60 Minutes, or, one of the major networks, or, local state constitutions and governments. They look into these things. So, and we know that, elections can be rigged, and there are problems here and there in our own elections, and certainly in other countries, this is an issue. So, I was just kind of wait and see. And then when Attorney General Bill Barr came out and said, we launched the Department of Justice investigation into this, we found no fraud at all. And then each of the states that were contested came out and said, yeah, we looked into it, no fraud. And I thought, well, that'll put an end to that, because most of us trust the experts that are on our side, right? We don't trust the experts necessarily on the other side. And so, much to my utter amazement, the people that were sticking by Trump, who never came around to recognize that his own Department of Justice's conclusions, the Republicans were kind of torn. Well, which side should I pick? My own team, like Mike Pence and Bill Barr, who are I trust, or Trump, who's the president. And and this is getting worse. Now we are on October 15th, and the percentage of Republicans who say they think the election was rigged and Trump really won is going up. So I have no idea what the solution to this is.
I thought it was much lower than that. Well, no, but it's not, because as you're now telling me, it's going up, which I didn't know. Well, I mean, everything that happens allows Trump to weigh in on it, to give some more, assertions that they discover the Republican assessment in Arizona comes out saying, "Gee, actually, Biden did a little better than the polling was." You would think that would be the end of it, but no. Trump comes on saying, "Oh my, they're finding terrible. You can't believe the stuff they're finding in Arizona about what went wrong." I mean, do people? I don't understand how one can just accept that. It's just beyond me.
Right.
But you do mention something to step away just for a moment from the gloom and doom. I mean, one of the most optimistic events of recent years is the behavior of Republican election officials across the country. I mean, to my knowledge, not a single one bought into the conspiracy theories here. They just said, nope, it was done right here. But of course, it looks like that's enough to get quick back to our earlier mood. It looks like Republicans are now rigging things so that they actually can throw elections. I mean, making legislatures responsible for the decisions instead of election officials. So it's quite terrifying.
We can hope that the Liz Cheneys and Mitt Romneys of the Republican Party, who still have a commitment to truth and reality and the electoral process, win out over the other side. I mean, they're quite conflicted. I'm seeing flags around Southern California here in little pockets of Trump 2024. It's like, whoa, really, Republicans? This is the best you've got? I mean, come on. Where are the brains? Here's what I like to say. Where's the Jeffersons and Madisons and Hamiltons, or the Lincolns and the Douglases? And I think maybe they all went into tech industry or Wall Street rather than politics.
Right. No, it is amazing when you think back to the caliber of people who founded the Republic. I mean, when was the last person we had of anything like that caliber? Roosevelt. I mean, there have been clever people. I mean, Carter was, judging from his press conferences, the evidence of his intelligence is that it was smarter than almost any other president we've had in terms of just the quality of his language. A perfectly terrible president. I mean, he was. So, and actually, one of the things I'm thinking about doing is writing a paper on how far sheer intelligence is from being sufficient. It was Robert Reich, who was the dwarf who was Clinton's Secretary of Labor, was in law school at the same time as Hillary Clinton. And he said, her the question was, her hand went up, every time. And often she was called on. And he said, her answers were never good. They were always perfect. I mean, there's no question this person with extremely high IQ who could then say in the course of her election, half the supporters of my opponent are a basket of deplorables. Anybody can make a single slip, but she actually ran a terrible campaign. Both times, when she ran against Obama and when she ran against Trump. It was sort of classically bad campaigns. And she's got somebody next to her who was quite a good campaigner, thank you, namely Clinton.
Trump, yeah. In your work on intelligence, maybe here would be a good way to introduce emotional intelligence or social intelligence, or something other than just raw IQ is clearly not enough. Maybe that's what you're talking about here.
Well, actually, it's more like common sense. I mean, it's, if you teach graduate school at a place like Michigan, you constantly see people with, super high IQs that, they're off the charts. But they can't figure out how to do rather simple things. I mean, that's actually part of this paper that I may or may not ever write. That is, IQ and a subway token will get you into town. And it certainly isn't the case that the higher the IQ in a very linear way, the better you are at any position. There's a quote that I love from the sage of Omaha. What the heck is his name? I'm forgetting.
Buffett. Warren Buffett.
Warren Buffett. Right. Said, investing is not a game where the guy with the highest IQ wins. If you've got an IQ of 160, you might as well sell 30 of those points because you're not going to need them.
Right.
I mean, what gets you a high IQ, the super high IQs, it's stuff, it's not unimportant. I mean, the larger your vocabulary, the more stuff you can understand. There's no doubt about that. But the things that are ancillary, auxiliary to sort of raw smarts that'll get you an IQ score. I mean, they include originality, creativity, grit, social. The great physiologist Hans Selye said, success in science is a multiplicative thing. It's raw smarts times hard work, times ability to get along with people, times originality, etc. And he says, none of those things has to be extraordinarily high in order to be very, very good at science. But if anything's close to zero, the whole thing comes to naught. That my lifetime experience has just taught me over and over again the truth of that. How much is needed other than just raw smarts in order to be effective in any field.
I think of it as like an asymptotic curve that's coming up, where IQ matters down here, where the curve is going up dramatically. But once you get up to a certain plateau, a certain level, it's going to plateau off. So such that, let's say you get into medical school, everybody there is super smart. They're all 130 IQ or above. Or you get into MIT or Caltech in quantum physics or something, and everybody has an IQ of 145, 3 standard deviations up above the mean. And so what happens after that IQ is not going to make any difference. It's going to be need of achievement or drive or creativity or thinking out of the box or something like that.
That's a very good way to think about it. And pure smarts matters less and less as the task difficulty goes up and as the IQ of the person is concerned. A good point.
Let's talk about other influences in how lives turn out. This is an subject of interest to me, and your research on the development of, say, personality and intelligence and so on. Earlier in your book, you talk about the role of your parents and religiosity and peer groups and mentors, and so let's use examples from your own life as a kind of a case study in the larger idea of how lives do turn out. To what extent do parents matter? At some point, they don't matter much. Peer groups matter more. And then at what point do mentors and teachers come in, and culture at large moves you one direction or another?
So you're asking me to assess the relative importance of each of these things?
Yeah, using your examples, like, you talk about your parents and the influence they had on you, and then you were a Methodist, and your interesting stories about that, I found, to what extent religion influences people and or not.
Right. Well, I think surely the biggest influence of my parents that I can think is my mother used to read me really good stuff from very early on. I mean, Little Women and Robert Louis Stevenson, Treasure Island, and even just Mother Goose. Mother Goose is wonderful for establishing, poetic sense and so on. So I was read good stuff, and then I started reading at an early age. I mean, some people have a taste for reading, and some people don't have so much of a taste for reading. And I read a lot. And one thing I mentioned that I think is probably important to my development as a scientist was being alone as much as I was. There were not other kids in my neighborhood. I lived in areas where one was a farming area. My family had nothing to do with that. It's just where the house was. So there were not other children. And I mentioned in the book a fascinating finding that one person who tried to look at what will predict success as a scientist, and almost nothing other than just cognitive ability really predicts. The single best predictor was how sick the scientist was as a child. And now, who knows why that's important? But I think it's because if you're sick, you've got lots of time to read instead of playing kick the can out in the neighborhood, and lots of time to think. And since I was somewhat of an isolate as a child, I was out roaming the world all the time, thinking, and when I wasn't doing that, I was reading. So certainly those things had an influence.
You were an only child?
And you were an only child?
I'm sorry? Yeah, no, well, in effect, my brother was born when I was 7, so I was an only child for quite a while. The being alone, I think, was important. And you mentioned the religion. I was raised in a very standard, mainstream Protestant household, but Methodists are a little bit different from other people. They're just there's a reason why they're called Methodists. They do everything right. I mean, they do their best. I mean, Hillary Clinton was raised as a Methodist, and she's dogged, conscientious, and that's me. The biggest compliment I ever get from people say, "My God, you're so conscientious." Oh, thank you. So that comes from the Methodist background. But by the time I was 15, I was no longer a believer. So if you had asked me when I was in my late teens, my 20s, is there any influence of your religious background? No, I don't believe in all that stuff. There's no influence of that. And then when in early middle age, I read the Protestant Revolution book by
Weber's book.
Weber's book.
That's
Max
right.
Weber's book.
Max Weber.
The Protestant capital of the Protestant Revolution, Protestant ethic. And he's writing about Methodists. That's 100 years ago he was writing, and he was writing about Methodists 100 years before then. I said, I'm the shock of recognition. My God, that's me. So I say I'm ethnically Methodist. I have a very good friend who says, he's never believed in God at all, but he's ethnically Catholic. It's a different kind of
culturally.
ethnicity.
I know a lot of my Jewish friends are cultural Jews. They're atheists.
Right,
yeah.
Right. I claim to be an honorary cultural Jew, since virtually, and this is another kind of impact on my life. From the time I was 17 on, nearly all my friends were Jewish. My wife is Jewish. It's sort of, I went to college at Tufts because I thought, well, that's a liberal arts college. It's in New England, and I knew I didn't fit in Texas, so maybe I'm a New Englander at heart. No, honk. I'm closer to Texas than I am to New England, but what I really am is a New York Jew. So that's
funny.
That's the ethnicity that fits.
Yeah, right. So, we go many places from here. I mean, I think. Well, first of all, we don't know which way is the causal arrow. Your parents, of course, also give you genes. So it could be your parents are high in conscientiousness for other reasons, and they also happen to be Methodist. So in hindsight, you look back and go, well, I'm a Methodist culturally or whatever, but it was actually the genes for conscientiousness or some blend thereof. Well, but of course we want to know. Yes, that's right. Yeah, the behavior geneticists tell us it's at least 50% of the variants, or probably more, for the big five: personality, everything. Yeah. But of course, that's now politically fraught, because then it's a sense, well, if it's highly heritable, then we can't do anything about it politically, culturally, socially, and so therefore we're not going to like those kind of findings. But I trust you don't buy that kind of blank slate idea. Of social change.
Right. No, it is very hard to think about things knowing that there's a substantial genetic component. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of this book that's come out by University of Texas, a psychologist called
Paige Harden. Yeah, I had her on the show.
You did? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, gee, I'm going to have to listen to that.
Yeah, she's a pretty far left liberal, a progressive really, who says liberals need to embrace behavior genetics to get social justice.
Right. Apropos of what the hell can people believe? I mean, there are people, even in a university, you talk about genetic contribution to IQ, and they say, first of all, you believe in IQ, and secondly, you think that genes could be... Yep. Sorry. People think it's all over if there's a substantial genetic component. Well, there's not at all. In fact, that's one thing I spent a lot of time on. As you know from my book, after studying reasoning and inference for decades, every psychologist knows a lot about IQ and intelligence. And I knew somewhat more because it's close to the things I was doing research on. At some point, and this is like 15 years ago, I started thinking in a systematic way about IQ and intelligence. And I began to realize the whole edifice is, ready to be toppled over. And I think with a lot of help from some very, very, very good intellects in fields other than psychology, by the way, because I think it was easier to learn some of the things that we now know about IQ from people who weren't psychologists. And two of the most important people, one is a political scientist by background, the other is an economist. I mean, everybody, educated people believe the following about IQ and intelligence. They basically believe what the bell curve told them, which was, in fact, the school solution at the time. It was they weren't making up stuff. They weren't renegades. They said, IQ is at least 60% of the variance in IQ is genetic, and possibly as high as 80%. Early childhood environment does very little for IQ, virtually nothing after adolescence, late adolescence. The race difference in IQ is about 15 points between blacks and whites, and that is partially genetic in origin. Asians have a somewhat higher IQ than people of European extraction, and that's probably partly genetic as well. And early childhood education is useless, doesn't do a thing. I think most educated people, highly educated, believe most of that, and every single thing I just said is wrong. All of it. I mean, first of all, the way we calculate the genetic contribution to intelligence, it isn't wrong, but it gives a very misleading impression. And Jim Flynn, who's the political scientist of the Flynn effect, I mean, he's the guy who discovered, contrary to everybody's opinion, we're actually getting smarter, not dumber. Oh, by the way, that's
3 points every decade.
That's right. And Herrnstein and Murray and the bell curve said we're almost surely getting dumber all the time because in the last 100 and so years, smart people are not having many babies and stupid people are having more babies, so we're slowly getting dumber. Actually, we're fairly rapidly getting smarter. Certainly higher IQ, although figuring out how much of the IQ gain is really intelligence, that's a complicated business. But certainly IQ has been going up. So almost everything that people believe, the base was wrong. The genetic so I was going to give Jim Flynn's analogy. He says, imagine two identical twins separated at birth, dropped randomly by helicopter on different families. So on average, they are in environments that are as different on average as any two environments that would be chosen. But they're both, because they have the same genetic composition, they're both tall, strong, fast. Are they going to have the same environment with respect to basketball? No. They're going to have very different environment. They're going to have the same environment, no matter how different in other respects their environment is. They're going to play a lot of basketball. They're going to be chosen on the team. They're going to be the coach is going to take an interest in them. They're going to be highly similar with respect to their basketball playing ability, and it isn't. But all of that, all of the contribution of the environment gene interaction gets attributed to genes. And that's not wrong, but it's extremely misleading because you put one of those kids, in an environment where there's no basketballs, the correlation goes very far down. They're going to be quite different. And then Flynn says, and I borrow the argument, it's the same way with intelligence. An intelligent kid modifies the environment. It's interesting to read to by parents. It's interesting to have conversations with, as opposed to just tell them, do this, don't do that. Going to hang out with smarter people. There's an expression saying you are the average of the 6 people you spend the most time with. And they're going to get noticed by teachers. They're going to be given extra work. They're going to be encouraged. They're going to be getting positive feedback about the content. So our genes interact with our environment. They modify our environment. And by the way, before I get off the topic of IQ, because that may not be the thing you most want to discuss.
No, I do.
No, I do.
Oh, okay. So early childhood environment is unbelievably important. If you take a kid from a lower class family, you've got two kids there, let's say identical twins, one raised in the family of origin and one raised in an upper middle class environment, that's worth 12 to 18 points on adult IQ.
Wow.
And that's all she wrote. That's it. We now know that what happens in the home, in the early childhood environment, is incredibly important to cognitive skills. Now, does this have implications for whether the Congress ought to pass the early childhood education part of that act? And yes, there's nothing more important. And the climate, I suppose, is more important than that, but nothing else is more important.
I don't know.
The Nobel.
But hey, yeah, let's just drill down that on a minute. So what is going on in these families? So you mentioned earlier reading and vocabulary. We know from studies on the relationship of poverty and vocabulary that poor kids hear, like order of magnitudes lower number of words by the time they're 10 or 15 or whatever than people from enriched environments or wealthier homes. And so what's going on? That the parents are just more parents are reading to their kids, and then the smarter ones are going to absorb more, and the parents are going to read more. So you get like a Matthew effect where to those who have more shall be given, and then the teachers notice this and so on. What could the government possibly do about this? I mean, these are private homes. You can't legislate what people do in the privacy of their homes, but maybe you could, I don't know, have enrichment programs or more books available that are free in libraries or I don't know what. How do you think about that?
Yeah, we have the experiment. Head Start. It's not an experiment. It's we don't know how valuable Head Start was really in any way. I don't believe, but we certainly know if you construct a really excellent early childhood education program, what that does, and it actually increases IQ, but that largely tends to fade. The IQ effect is largely gone by middle childhood. I mean, there may be, in the best programs, there may be like a 5-point IQ gain, which is certainly not trivial, but it's, but this was disappointing to a lot of people because they thought it would be more effective than that. But then it turns out, if you look at these kids who are in the very best programs, 30 years later in their lives, they're 50% more likely to, I'm going to be making up numbers here. I mean, it may be 37%, it may be 60%.
Yeah,
but I mean, they're big numbers, big effects on the likelihood of graduating from high school, the likelihood of going to college, the quality of the occupation which they ultimately are in, and the likelihood of being a public charge. The effects are huge, which the only interpretation of that is that it's not, there's no reason to believe it's really cognitive, certainly not cognitive in some sense that IQ tests pick up. It's probably more social, personal and interpersonal. Kids learn how to, first of all, they're given a non-chaotic environment. I mean, a lot of lower class environments are just chaotic.
Yeah.
I mean, nothing good happens there with respect to anything, certainly including cognitive development. So something that goes on in the best early childhood education programs is colossally important. And this economist has estimated that the payoff isn't, actually, I think he's wrong on this. He thinks the payoff per dollar spent on high quality early childhood education pays back $9. Actually, that's an extreme underestimate, I think, because he's not even placing a value on what it means, the difference between having a decent job and not being on welfare. And he doesn't give numbers to that, but I mean, we don't know what numbers to give them, but I mean, it's huge. Staying out of jail, that's another. I mean, these are what this means to the individual and to every person who comes in contact with this individual. We don't have a psychological evaluation to add into the economic evaluation there. So we don't, but we know it's enormous in terms of human well-being.
Right. So let's think about what our independent and dependent variables are here. We want to know why there's inequality in society. How come some people make so much money and so many other people don't? And so many people in the richest nation ever are, just above the poverty line or just below it, just struggling to make ends meet. Divorce rates are high, fatherless homes, and, all these kinds of things we're looking at to try to figure out why, or impoverished neighborhoods. And we have this zip code system of public education in which, again, you get a Matthew effect, to those who have more shall be given. So the richer neighborhoods have better schools. And so more parents move to those neighborhoods because they want good schools for their kids. So the property tax rates go up, driving the house prices up and further dividing themselves from average and impoverished people. And then those schools get crappier and crappier. And then maybe have a local government and just throw some money at it, but the money by itself may not do it. You have to have, some directed money, something like that. And then we end up asking questions like, why are there not more African-American programmers at Google? That's such a high level question to find what the cause of that is multifactorial. You have to look at lots of different things. I don't know. I'm just kind of free associating here from what you said, but how do you think about the larger problem? We don't want to have such an unequal society. We want a fair and just society, even if there's some unequal outcomes. We want people to have the equal opportunity to do these things, and clearly that's not the case. And so this impoverished home environment is one, and schools is another, and peer groups. So if you're running with gangs, that's not good. That's your chaotic environment, and so on. If you were czar, if you were president, you mentioned in your book you had ambitions of running for president when you were a kid, just for fun. So if you were president before you deposed yourself and demanded a recount, what would you do? What would you suggest to your administration to do something about these inequalities?
Well, early childhood education is hands down the most important thing. But it turns out, rich countries are not all alike with respect to what you were just talking about. Our lower class, much of it is an underclass. I mean, and here's a spectacular result, and it comes from actually Paige Harden's advisor, who's Eric Turkheimer, has discovered the following. The genetic contribution to the variation in child's IQ in upper middle class families is 80%. I mean, the genetic, if two kids differ who are with an upper middle class background with respect to their IQ, most of that is can be attributed to genes. So that actually equals the high estimate that Herrnstein and Murray gave to the whole ball of wax in their book, The Bell Curve. But for lower class kids, when they grow up, the genetic contribution to IQ is practically zero. I mean, that's just, you hear that as, how can that possibly be? And the answer is, well, first of all, talk about the upper middle class family. Upper middle class families provide excellent environments for their children's intellect to blossom. And there isn't that much difference between Dr. Smith's family and Lawyer Jones's family. They're pretty much the same place in terms of cognitive socialization. But in lower class environments, although some are as good as you would ever find in any upper middle class family home, there's lots of chaos. I mean, utter disruption. I mean, I've been in schools where in the inner city, where I'm told, I mean, showcase schools, the very best. Somebody paid, $50 million to educate the kids in this area of Bedford-Stuyvesant. Those, they report these kids cry when they have to go home at the end of the day. They've had such a wonderful time in this benevolent environment. So if the environment is so extremely variable with respect to cognitive socialization, it's the environment that's going to be driving the bus. Genes don't much matter. The way Herkheimer thinks about it is, if you got a bad enough environment, it doesn't matter how good your genes are. You're not going to be very smart. I mean, it's just so okay. So that's by background to getting to the question that you were raising initially, and this is that it turns out that in Europe, it looks like, especially in Scandinavia, the point that I just made about lower class and genetic contribution to intelligence doesn't hold. In other words, there isn't much difference in the genetic contribution to IQ between lower classes and upper middle classes in Scandinavia. Now, we don't know why that is true, but is I think a pretty good guess to say it's because the social welfare system is such that these kids are, taken care of. They're removed for a large fraction of the day from chaotic environments. There are interventions by the state to help make the family setting not be so chaotic. And by the way, we have interventions at the level of infancy. I mean, if a 14-year-old girl has a baby, she's not going to be very good at the job. But you can bring in experts to come in and help say, well, if the baby's doing this is what the baby wants, and you probably shouldn't correct the baby in that way. This stuff has measurable effects, benevolent outcomes for kids. So this is why I get back to the incredible importance of getting something a little bit closer to the European system.
So if we were to treat these as experiments and then look at the outcomes, and you were a policymaker or an education advisor, and you look at Scandinavia, you go, well, we should do that. And then what happens? Well, then Congress would have to pass some legislation about increasing taxes for early education programs or something like that. And then conservatives are going to come in and go, no, we're already spending too much money on that. So here I'll just channel the kind of conservative response to everything you just said, which I agree with, is that this is the job of parents, not the government. And that if parents weren't getting divorced, if they had some values like Christian values, sort of a biblical values, back to your Methodism, where the parents stay married, even if they're not getting along. You stay married for your kids. You provide for your children. You are responsible, and you get them all the way to high school and graduate, and you help them go to college or get a job, and you instill in them values like do not get pregnant out of wedlock. That's chaos for the rest of your life. And use birth control, and so on and so on. Just have some standards there. To which, a lot of liberals are like, well, that's nice if you're rich, but poor families, they just fall apart, and they don't have that kind of I don't know what you want to say, self-control or in control of their own environments like that. It's easy to, and also the argument would be these European countries are much smaller and more homogeneous than America. And that it's one thing to say, well, there's a perfect model, let's do what they're doing. You can't do that in 50 different states. We have a Department of Education, but it's not like they can tell all 50 states, this is what you should do. Each state does something different. And so you see what I'm getting at, the problem there. So how do you respond to that kind of typical conservative reply to that?
Actually, I do have an answer that I like a lot. Believe it or not, it comes from work by Charles Murray, whom I despise, by the way, because
you do.
You do.
Oh yeah, well, he said a lot of things that were wrong. I mean, especially it was unforgivable to report that black-white difference in IQ and express the opinion that that it's substantially genetic in origin. And this isn't a top. If you want to get into the topic, I can. I mean, I can.
Well, you kind of addressed that with Turkheimer's example, I think.
What's that?
I think you kind of rebutted that with Turkheimer's examples of, to what extent IQ matters and that genetics make a difference or not. It makes no difference if you're all the way up here in this enriched environment.
Right, exactly. So that's one answer to that. But Murray, to his great credit, published a book a while back called Coming Apart. Are you familiar with the book?
That. Yeah, I am.
Yeah,
I am.
So the data in there are astonishing. He looks at the upper 20% of the socioeconomic scale in this country and the bottom 40% of the socioeconomic scale, and compares them with respect to a huge number of variables related to social health, economic health, but especially social variables like out of wedlock births, participation in any kind of face-to-face group like a bowling league or the church, the percentage of males in the workforce. And the people he's looking at they're all whites. So let's get that off the table. I'm just talking about white people here. And he's only talking about people between the ages of 20 and 50, I mean, prime of life. So what did these variables look like in 1960 for these two social economic groups? And the answer is pretty much the same dang thing. I mean, the same presence in religious organizations, the presence in face-to-face political organizations, the likelihood of out of wedlock births, both parents in the home, all of this stuff, very little difference between these two groups. 50 years later, the bottom has fallen out for the least favored 40%. It's a disaster. I mean, it looks like black families in the ghetto 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. I mean, and of course, more recently, we have the data on deaths of despair from the Princeton economists.
Deaton.
And
Deaton.
Well, why is this, and what could be done? And now Murray becomes a lunatic. He says, the problem is, two answers. One is the failure of the upper classes to preach what they practice. And just like he was saying, young men, get a good job. young man, finish your schooling. Young lady, don't have that baby yet. That would have taken care of this problem. Somehow you feel that's not really going to do the job. And the other problem is, during this whole period, welfare has increased, which is a disincentive to work and so on, and so on. Actually, it's not even true that welfare has declined, has increased during that period. Under the Clinton regime, there was a very substantial cutback.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And anyway, it's a terrible argument, because who has more social welfare programs, us or Europe? And Europe does not have this problem. The only group of people in the world whose life expectancy has gotten shorter in the last 50 years is white Americans. No other white people.
That's kind of a temporary thing, right? Because of the opioid crisis and these other deaths of despair. It's not like your life is going to be shorter because of this average. It's that if you don't get hooked on opiates, your life won't be shorter, or you don't run with gangs and you're not in the inner city where there's homicides.
But, if you're fortunate enough to be in the middle class, the upper middle class, you're not going to have those things either. It's not.
Right.
The drugs, in my view, are a consequence of the economic status. But the good jobs have largely gone from. I live in Michigan, and you go these towns where the only buildings are Dollar General and health clinics. There's no economic activity going on there. There are people who were making, in today's terms, $30 an hour are now making $10 an hour as security guards and home health aides. It's the economy has collapsed for people at the bottom, and their behavior has come tumbling after.
Right. So that would address directly your enriched early childhood education and enriched environments. They have the opposite of that. Just throwing more money at it is probably not enough, because there's other factors at work here, perhaps. Maybe to reconfigure what you said that Charles Murray would say, that is kind of the standard conservative perspective that I channeled a little bit earlier. It sounds kind of preachy, but I've had several conservatives on the show. I had Jason Hill, who's a Haitian immigrant, and Jason Riley from the Wall Street Journal, who's an African American, wrote a biography of Thomas Sowell. And I haven't been able to get Thomas Sowell on because he doesn't do media, but a few others. And so here's their argument that back in 1965, Patrick Moynihan had that report on the looming crisis in the African American community of high divorce rate. 25% of children were born out of wedlock and were raised by single moms, no dad in the family. And he considered that a crisis in the early 60s. And now it's 75%, I'm told, by these scholars who study this stuff, and that, it's even worse. So, but, why is that? And maybe it's part of this cascading, spiraling effect downward from poverty, in which there's, less commitment, less reason to make a commitment to a marriage and so on. But conservatives will say this happened because the state intervened. This happened because of Johnson's Great Society. Before 1960, rates of marriage in African American communities were going up. They were almost the same as whites, and so this is what I'm told. I haven't really looked at this data carefully, but that then when the state intervened, essentially women were marrying the state rather than the man. Something like that. That's the argument that they make. And so, again, to channel the conservative, I'm not a conservative, but their arguments is that kind of preachy, young man, get a job. Well, but these are factors that make a difference. Like, you should graduate from high school. You should get a job or go to college. Don't get married until you can, afford support a family and don't have children until you have enough money and so on and so forth, and be married and whatnot. And these are kind of simple factors to keep people out of poverty. What's wrong with that? Even maybe we take out the preachy aspect of it, but aren't those? Think of them as social science variables that we could study. Like, yes, that causes that, much of like what you just described. And maybe it's again easy for you and I to say that, but maybe somebody who has to work 3 jobs just to make a living can't even think about those things. Anyway, I'm kind of free associating here, but I think those are a way to think about it.
It's a good to have those things out on the table. But one kind of response I make, okay, so we should be telling these people to behave differently, these whites at the bottom. So why is it that upper middle class people stopped preaching to lower class people to get a job and don't have your baby? 1960, suddenly upper middle class, screw them, I'm not going to give any more preaching. They have to take care of themselves. So that's just not, that won't. So the story there, the conservative story, has a stumbling block. Why did the situation get so much worse? I mean, the preaching thing is not plausible. The other thing that has very little plausibility is the difference between Europe and the U.S. Why didn't this happen in Europe for that class of people? Mm-hmm. And it didn't because the state was intervening to raise the quality of the environment of children, and that has helped. And in my view, almost surely has helped to sustain that group and make it somewhat better off. I'm hoping. I'm delighted to see these working class jobs. People saying, guess what? I'm not going to do this for $8 an hour anymore. I want $20 an hour, and employers say, oh my God, I guess we're going to have to do that if we want to stay in business. So I think that it's conceivable that we're entering a period of improvement in the situation for people at the bottom of society.
I wonder if there's other government policies, like already, for example, I'm a homeowner and I get to deduct the interest on my mortgage from my income tax. Well, that's incentivizing people. The government seems to want me to be a homeowner, and I have a 5-year-old, so I get a tax break for that, and I get a deduction. So I guess the government wants me to have children, right? So maybe there's policies like that could help. Just tax breaks, tax incentives, nudging people to do this, get married, have children, own homes. And I wonder if there's more we could do along those lines.
Right. Yeah. I would think so. I mean, I'm no student of social policy, to tell the truth, anywhere, but certainly not of Europe. I mean, I don't know how. But I'll say this: the inkling I had of the conversation that we're having now, in my early 20s, mid 20s, I went to Sweden, and after I'd been there for a while, I realized I don't think I've seen any lower class people. I mean,
really?
The baggage handler was like a college student. I mean, look alive, alert, interesting, pleasant. He obviously feels like he's a part of it. I told this recently to a friend who's raised in Minnesota. He says, "Oh yeah, Minnesota used to be like that," and of course, Minnesota is very substantially Scandinavian. It's
right.
For some reason, for 1,000 years at least, Scandinavians have been egalitarians. They don't like it when some people do a lot better than others, and their tax structures reflect that today. So they're also
Yeah,
they've always been.
I was going to say,
Go
let's
ahead,
transition to your other area of one of your many areas of research, that is cultural differences even within the United States, say between North Englanders, say, and Southerners. You mentioned Texas, and there's these famous experiments you and your colleagues did of testing how people from the South respond differently to challenges or insults or threats than people from the North. I remember, I think this was your experiment where the subjects in the experiment have to fill out a form and then walk down some hallway to turn it into somebody. And along the way, somebody there bumps into them and says something like asshole, and it kind of insults them. And then you measure their stress levels and how they respond and so on. And people, if I recall this, students from Southern states were much more insulted by this. They were, kind of the culture of honor. And they responded, much more hostility. Whereas students from northern states were much more apologetic. Oh, I'm so sorry. So talk about these kind of cultural differences. And does that stem back centuries from how these states filled up from different parts of Europe?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, we call it a culture of honor. And yes, that was my experiment. That's my favorite experiment. It was the first experiment to have in the abstract of a scientific journal the word asshole. So
right.
That's
right.
That's
funny.
That's funny. But here's the history of that. I got to, my joke is at the age of 17, I left Texas to go to college in a foreign country, Boston. And it was so incredibly different physically and in absolutely every way. And much of it I didn't like. I didn't like the fact that people seemed rude in the East. To tell the truth, they still seem rude to me in the East. It's that sort of filed that away as being interesting. And then, I'm thinking about cultures, South versus North. I say, well, yeah, Northerners are rude, but there's this thing. Middle-class Northerners don't kill each other. And in Texas, it can happen and does happen. I mean, this on Monday morning, the Smith boy comes in. He shot the Jones boy over the weekend. Or I actually have a relative who shot her husband when she found him in flagrante delicto. It's so it that happens. That's interesting. I mean, so Massachusetts has the Gardner Museum and lobster, and they don't kill each other, and so there are lots of differences.
The New England woman would call her lawyer instead of getting the gun.
That's right. That's right. About in the late 80s, early 90s, I decided I have all these cultural ideas. I want to test the difference between cultures. But even then, I realized there's a risk. As a white male, that's scary territory to step into, to start talking about cultural comparisons. So I think I'll start with something bad about white males. I'll demonstrate that there is this homicide difference, and there is a big homicide difference between North and South. So I started looking at questions that have been asked by polling outfits about whether aggression is more accepted in the South than in the North. And for a host of variables, there's no difference. Or actually, like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I mean, Southerners are actually less in favor of that than Northerners. But there was this class of things where people did, in the South, were more inclined toward aggression. And it turns out they all had in common that there was probably an insult involved. So it's lovers' quarrels, neighbors' quarrels, barroom incidents. And it's only that class of homicide, which is that is likely to involve an insult, that's higher in the South. And a Southern sociologist, a friend of mine, has said, if you stay out of the wrong bars and bedrooms in the South, you're safer than in the North. So I started looking for evidence that the insult issue was what was involved. By the way, I was put onto this by the head of Mediterranean studies at the University of Aix-en-Provence, who said, I told him about these days, says, oh, yeah, it's a culture of honor. The South is like the Mediterranean. It's a culture of honor. You insult me and you're going to pay for it. So we started looking at the behavior, and the study that you described, my favorite dependent variable in a study I ever used was testosterone level. Northerners and Southerners were equal in that, and if you insult a Northerner, the testosterone level doesn't change. You insult a Southerner, the testosterone level goes up. He's ready for a fight.
Wow.
Now, why is it that way? And again, my French connection told me, here's why that happens, is because people in Northern Europe, they're farmers for the most part. But in Southern Europe, they're herdsmen. And if you're a herdsman, you've got to establish you are not to be trifled with. You stay off my property, you touch my animal, you're in big trouble. You insult me, you're a goner if you don't apologize. I mean, it's a stance that you take that won't tolerate and won't take any guff, won't take any insult. It's an economic stance. Well, P.S. The North was founded by English and Germans and Dutch. We're all farmers as a group. The South was founded by Scottish, Irish, Scotch-Irish especially, and these are herding societies. So they brought the culture of honor over here, and they continued, by the way, to do herding to a much greater extent than elsewhere, because I mean the mountains are not good for mass agriculture, and there are lots of wet mountain ranges in the South, and the desert is certainly not suitable for agriculture, for farming. So it's the South.
Just to drill into that a little bit more, is it that farmers have fences, and good fences make good neighbors, so they don't need a culture of honor because their animals are not going to run off into the other farm or whatever, whereas the herders, their property is on the hoof and moving, and so more easily stealable. So you need to cultivate a reputation of being a badass so that you don't get taken advantage of.
Exactly. That's exactly the story that we were telling. That's what I believe.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, is it a counter argument to say that, because there was something else about that democracy came later to the Southern states than the New England states? And part of what democracies do is they disarm their citizens, and we take it to court. And if democracy comes late in the Southern states, then it's better to be armed because you can't turn to the government, you can't trust the government to settle it. Like in the West, the nearest sheriff or courthouse is 90 miles away or whatever, and we're not going to, you can't call the sheriff, so you have to settle it yourself. So there was something like that that's maybe related. I don't know if that's contradicting your hypothesis or supplementing it.
No, well, a lot of what you're saying is consistent with it, and nothing that you're saying is inconsistent. The democracy thing, I haven't really thought about that much. Of course, New England was all about democracy, that's for sure. And Virginia was founded by royalists. So if you just look at those two, Massachusetts versus Virginia, that certainly fits that. I mean, Massachusetts was one of the world's earliest, greatest, most thoroughly democratic locales ever, and the South wasn't. And
I mean, I think we still see more support for for the Second Amendment and for the death penalty in southern states than in northern states. Probably still reflecting what you're talking about.
Right. No, we looked at a host of variables that are related to this. The corporal punishment, and this is a 20-year-old fact, but was much more common in southern schools. And it's illegal in that time, even in northern schools. The Southerners express comfort with the idea of parents physically punishing their children, and Northerners, by now in Sweden, you can go to jail for slapping your kid. So, and Southerners find that amusing. But,
yes.
Yes. But the democracy thing may have played. But you also mentioned something that I think really is extremely important part of the picture, which is that in hurting countries, hurting regions, the population is not dense at all. So the Ozarks and the lower Alleghenies and so on, there are very few people living there, and what they're doing mostly is hurting. So it's that contributes to the situation. There's a Georgia expression, or is this North Carolina? North Carolina expression: every man a sheriff on his own hearth.
Right.
By the way, apropos of your culture sticking with you, after I got started studying culture of honor, it dawned on me one day, I am a member of that culture to this day. I mean, I'm very sensitive to insults compared to my Jewish friends who are in that. They're quite comfortable dishing them out, and they're not that bothered, if taking it. But
interesting.
I'm left with that.
Interesting. Yes.
There's two things that.
There's two things that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I was going to say two things that came to mind from what you're talking about there. Donald Black, the sociologist of criminality, talks about this kind of culture of honor, what he calls self-help justice, that in inner cities, particularly with the people who don't trust the police, and probably for good reason. A lot of the police are corrupt and they're kind of badasses themselves, and you can't trust the court system. So why would I call a lawyer to settle our dispute? When you and I can settle this tonight at midnight, or in the case of illegal drugs, if I have this corner and you have that corner, and you and I have a dispute about who's going to sell the drugs to whom, we can't take it to court. we have to settle this ourselves. So that drives crimes up. And he points out, if you look at the police blotters of why people commit homicide, it's right off. It's like, I think he said it was 90% moralistic in nature. That is to say, it wasn't instrumental, like I killed him to get his Rolex or his car. I killed him because he slept with my girlfriend, or he insulted me in front of my buddies. He scratched my car. He took my parking spot. These kind of, and that happens more, not just in the South more than in the North, although that's true, but also inner cities where people don't trust the police and they have to take the law into their own hands because everybody wants justice and fairness.
Well, the inner city is a culture of honor, and that's. I mean, as witness what you just said, that most of the murders are not because you you took over my territory for selling drugs. They're mostly because you dissed me. So I'm going to take that. So, yeah, that's
right.
It
Yeah,
definitely
let's switch topics. I enjoyed your observation in the book about how much of the development of social psychology was by Jews, sort of post-World War II immigrants chased out of anti-Semitic Nazi Germany. And so I gather from that you're arguing that in a way, as social scientists, we want to know how does somebody become a Nazi? How does a country like Germany, of highly educated, cultured, the people that gave us Beethoven and Goethe and so on, how do they become goose-stepping Nazis in a matter of a few years? How do you think about the kind of the culture of social science in that respect?
Yeah, well, it is certainly a mystery. I mean, it's more of a mystery than most people realize, because it was widely believed in 1930 that Germany was the least anti-Semitic country in Europe. And there's a datum consistent with that. The intermarriage rate for Jews in Germany in 1930 was 50%.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So, this isn't by way of it, making any attempt to explain the mystery. It only makes the mystery deeper. I mean, the French would have been, frankly, some of my best friends are French, but they would have been a more plausible candidate for Nazism than, I mean, after all, Napoleon, what was he? He was dry run for Nazism, but that's not quite fair. There were some good things about Napoleon, of course, as well. But I don't know. There's no comprehending it. I mean, in a city where there was going to be a massacre of Jews, the soldiers or the police who were going to carry it out invited their families to come and watch. I mean, it's just
to
me, it's the most unfathomable event in modern history. I mean, it's just
Although apropos of that last example, you see pictures from the 1920s in the southern United States, of families going out for a lynching. There's pictures online you could see where the people are all dressed up. It's like, this is a big family fun event, and we're going to lynch this African American. Wow, stunning! That's not just a century ago, here in America.
I imagine you've read Caste, that book by, I've forgotten the author's name. Oh, it's a fabulous book.
Oh, yes. Yes, I have read that. Wilkinson, Isabel Wilkerson. Yes, a very moving book. I'm not sure go ahead.
Oh, well,
I think,
yeah, that book, I didn't think that book had anything to tell me that I didn't already know. But of course it does. I mean, the connection between the U.S. South and Nazism is astonishing. It's just amazing. I mean, the people who are plotting exactly what they're going to do to the Jews in Germany are studying what the South did about its blacks, and in some cases, apparently, according to her, finding the South a little too harsh. Let's not go that route.
Well, we know at the Nuremberg trials that one of the Nazis' defense about their eugenics program is, we were doing what the United States was doing. I mean, California sterilized something like 75,000 people in the course of several decades. Virginia did, and there was that famous Supreme Court case of Buck versus Bell, that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. We have to put a stop to this. This is, like 1920s, 1930s America. in which the eugenics program was largely a liberal, a kind of a progressive cause. That if we can engineer a better society from the top, we can also do it through genetics. And yeah, so the Nazis copied some of that, although obviously we didn't have extermination camps. But that comes down the line. You get kind of a cascading buildup over time to do that. I've been thinking about this after reading Hugo Mercier's book. I don't know if you know this book, Not Born Yesterday. So Hugo is a French, cognitive psychologist. I think that's right. Anyway, he suggests that perhaps the majority of Germans did not buy into the Nazi program. Maybe they liked the economic policy that pulled them out of the Depression, the Autobahn and other things that Hitler did that were good for economically in the 30s. But they probably didn't completely buy into the exterminationist program of anti-Semitism. Certainly anti-Semitism was common in all European countries, but maybe not to the extent that Hitler took it. But by the time Hitler had power, the majority couldn't do anything about it. So you get a pluralistic ignorance or a spiral of silence, where either everybody thinks everybody else is buying into the whole Nazi program, even though most are not. And spirals of silence are broken when dissenters can speak out, and then everybody could see, oh, I'm not the only one. Most other people don't buy this either, and then you can have social change that way. But if you punish dissenters by sending them off to concentration camps, particularly camps like Dachau, they're in Germany, where everybody can see the guy being hauled out of his house for speaking out against the regime, then people are just going to keep their mouths shut. And so I think it's possible the entire Nazi thing was held aloft in the ether by these two factors, this kind of spiral of silence and then punishment of dissenters, and can be carried on, for 12 years.
Right. Ministers who preached against Nazi practices were assassinated. They were killed by the state. People say, "Oh, where was Christianity there?" Well, they were in jail if they were lucky.
Right.
So,
right.
No, it's completely incomprehensible. In behalf of the Germans, I just was recently in Berlin, and it's quite remarkable. They have a marker on every block that reminds you of the Nazi era. This is the Rosenberg's house you're looking at, and who were executed in Auschwitz. And that's impressive. They're given that it happened. It wasn't by any means obvious that there would be the very vigorous, self-conscious reminder of the populace at every juncture.
In my book, The Moral Arc, I have pictures of these, what you're talking about, these stumbling stones, as they're called, of Holocaust remembrance. So they're these are black and white, but they're brass, and they're quite stunning. Basically, Julius Levy lived here. It's right in front of the house on the street, and was deported in 1941, where he was murdered. And, there's like 10,000 of these things around Germany. It was an art project initiated by an artist, kind of an exhibition in honor of this. It's quite stunning. So, you talk about, again, back to your book, talking about so many of your colleagues in the early social psychology field were Jewish. Well, obviously the biggest ones, Phil Zimbardo, Stanley Milgram, and the famous shock experiments and so on. How do you think that research has held up over the decades in terms of what they were trying to understand? That is, how could you get, a middle-class white college student to administer lethal levels of shock to somebody, obedience to authority or whatever, or in Phil's case, that you assign people these roles of guard or prisoner, and then they adopt those roles. How do you feel that research has held up?
Actually, I'm not a fan of Zimbardo's work. I never was. I always felt like he's communicating to them that there's a reason why you're a guard and a police and you're down here, and let's do some stuff. And by the way, someone told me recently that there was one individual who was the leader of all of who instigated it all. It was, it's only a single event, and
Not really an experiment.
I've never felt
Not really an experiment.
Yeah, I've never felt I was educated by what happened there. With Milgram, it's a totally different story. I mean, it remains astonishing even today. And by the way, I don't know if you're aware that there have been a couple of relatively recent replications of that study. They get the same number. I mean, they don't go all the way. They don't allow their people to go all the way to the
right.
But the people will continue. I think it's like
150 volts. I think it was. Yeah.
What? Yeah.
Jerry Berger did it in Oregon. They stopped it at 150 volts. Just for ethical reasons, but he still got slightly less, but still the majority of people went at least 150 volts.
Right, they continue. I believe it's after the point at which the guy says, "I have a heart condition." I believe it's after they. Right. 2/3 continue past that point. So that really hasn't changed. By the way, there's a fascinating study. About there's just a fascinating anecdote, I should say, about how Milgram happened to do that particular research. He started out, he got his shock machine going, set up. His intention was to compare obedience levels in Germany and the U.S., and he couldn't believe what he was finding in the U.S. Any national difference was going to be, of little interest compared to what he found on his home in New Haven.
Right. Right.
So I mean,
he also got not just these weren't just undergraduates doing it for beer money and extra credit for their grade, but actual real people out in the community, bus drivers and lawyers and doctors and secretaries or whatever. Just yeah. I did Go ahead.
Go ahead. Please go
ahead.
I
was going to say we did in 2010. I worked with Dateline NBC and Chris Hansen, a 2-hour special in which we replicated a number of famous psych experiments, like smoke in the room and people in an elevator where everybody in there is a shill except one, and they all turn around and face the back wall, things like that. But we actually built Milgram shock box, and we ran subject. We had 7 people run through the experiment. We just had a day to film this segment, and so we configured it as a applicants for contestants in a reality show called What a Pain, in which the participants would then deliver shocks to this poor sucker in the other room. And it was going to be super cool. In reality shows like this, there is a lot of that kind of stuff going on, which is kind of questionable morally, but they make good ratings. Anyway, we did it that way. We got, I think it was 4 of our subjects went all the way to 350, 450 volts. And but what was interesting, watching it from the back room, that most of them, you could tell they didn't want to do it. I mean, they were kind of squirming and complaining and turning to our experimenter, who was, a producer of the TV show, who's, screening applicants to be on the show. But he's reading, and we had the same text that Milgram used. And, and they would go, "Are you sure I should be doing this? Please continue." "But I don't want to continue." "Please continue." "But what if I hurt him?" "I take responsibility. Please continue." "All right." And they would just turn back and go for it. So here, to me, it seemed like they were conflicted inside. Like, I know I shouldn't be doing this. I don't like doing it. I want to be on the show. He's telling me I should do it. All right. And there the setting also I was thinking about, Milgram's at, he's at Yale University, right? It's a university professor, scientist in a lab coat with a clipboard. Or in our case, it's at NBC Studios. With a TV producer. At some level, I think they got to be thinking, well, they're not going to really kill somebody, are they? I mean, come on, somebody's taking responsibility for. I'm just a nobody trying out for this thing or whatever. So the diffusion of responsibility is maybe that's what it is, off to the scientist or the TV producer.
Right. Well, Milgram did a series of studies in New Haven. He set himself up, no connection to Yale. He just sets himself up in a storefront. He's doing research, but I don't know how to describe it. It doesn't say I'm Professor so and so or Doctor so and so. It just says I'm doing this study, and it made no difference or very little difference. People went ahead. So.
Well, that does imply we're, by nature, we're all susceptible to these kinds of influences.
Yeah. I'm sure you're knowledgeable about Pinker's book on violence. Yes,
of course, yes.
Of course, yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's I think it's a fabulous piece of cultural psychology. I mean, it's just, and I'm one of the most optimistic things I've ever encountered in my whole life. I mean that violence is just we don't do that so much anymore. I mean, it's been more or less steady decline these last 100,000 years.
Yes, I know Steve pretty well. He's a good friend. He was just here at the house, and we filmed an episode of the show for his new book, Rationality. But the thesis in The Better Angels of Our Nature is back to this kind of levels of self-control. That is the kind of civilizing process over the last several centuries in which people became, by second nature, more able to control their impulses. So this idea is that, we have these impulses bubbling up from our amygdala or whatever, in which we would like to do X, but, civilization has taught us, you just don't do that. You don't eat with your fingers. You use a fork. You're polite. You use a napkin. You don't blow your nose into the tablecloth, for example. These books of etiquette in the Middle Ages. It's like people were pretty gross to have to be told these are the things you shouldn't. Don't urinate in the hallway. Oh, really? Okay, I hadn't thought of that. So that in the long run, we've all kind of developed the ability to control our impulses such that we don't even think about it, right? And so back to your work, in a way, this culture of honor kind of takes the brake off that civilizing process, or it puts it internally, like civilization hasn't reached here yet, so you got to do it. You got to defend yourself because the state's not going to do it or civilize it.
One exception. I mean, it's an economically motivated breach in the wall of don't be violent. Don't be violent unless your herd is threatened, and then
right.
People have that stance. And unless you're insulted, because the insult affects your ability to protect your herd. I mean, it's just, at any rate, it's a carved out. That's the point. That's the carved out piece of violence from otherwise reasonably civilized stance.
Yeah.
Well, Richard, I want to be mindful of your time, but I don't want to let you go before I hit you on a couple of big subjects, current events like the metoo movement and the Black Lives Matter movement and so on. Pinker and myself and in the Moral Arc and others have tracked how much moral progress we've made over the last couple centuries, particularly since, say, the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, and how much better things are. And yet we still have things like the George Floyd killing and, the Jeffrey Epstein and Harvey Weinstein and, all these examples of business leaders, professors, hitting on their students, business leaders sleeping with their, colleagues that are beneath them in power and so on. And, it seems like, yes, we've made a lot of progress, but clearly there's still a lot of issues. It's stunning that in the second decade, now the start of the third decade of the 21st century, seems like there's a lot of men that just still don't get it. Or there's still a lot of police violence or something like that. And then we're kind of told through this these cognitive priming tests, like the what's that test called, the where you're associating subliminally associating words with faces. Sorry, it's escaping me now, but I think you know what I'm talking about here. But the idea is that we're all subconsciously still kind of racist and misogynist and bigoted, even if even if you think you're not, or you say, no, I'm not a racist, and yet, but still implicitly we're subconsciously racist or institutional racism. So just give us your thoughts on the current events and from what you know about human psychology and your research.
Well, I certainly was surprised by the Me Too business. I mean, I happen to have a friend who was in Hollywood for most of her life. Her name is Peggy Elliott. She was the writer on shows that you'll remember, That Girl and The Odd Couple. She wrote those TV shows. And when this came out, I said, God, all these people are invited. It must be 10% of the powerful men in Hollywood. She says, oh, 10%, you're kidding? That's a drop in the bucket. It's universal, practically.
Oh, wow.
So she may have been exaggerating, but even so, so that was a shock. The continued violence. I mean, it's my dear friend Lee Ross, who was my collaborator on much of my research, who died recently. He said he became familiar with law enforcement folks in San Francisco, and the police chief there, who I believe at the time was black, says, we get these guys. We get these police. They start the job. They're not bad guys, but the first thing that happens, they go out in a police car, and there's some kind of really awful thing that some black guy has done, and that just sort of continues, and they become. I mean, their job leads them to encounter people who are a risk to themselves, to others, to the police, all the time. So, it doesn't excuse anything, but, if you're a psychologist or an ethicist, like you have to be sympathetic to the victimizer to a degree. I mean, it isn't as if. And by the way, apropos of the importance of the situation, here's a question I ask people. I'll ask you: how do you suppose that the junta in Argentina of 30 years ago, who were torturing and murdering their fellow citizens, how do you suppose they recruit to get people to do that? And I won't ask you. You can just think of it. You don't have to tell me anything. Just think about how would you? And the answer is you have a notice in the newspaper saying there's a job available with the government. That's the way they get it.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, so I don't know.
Well,
nevertheless,
so it does support what Milgram was finding. That is, you could just take ordinary people and in the court, and just their own experiences. So it's natural for us to categorize people like we categorize everything into conceptual bins or boxes. So on the job, you see more, let's say, inner city crime, and there's more blacks living in the inner city. So you start stereotyping, and pretty soon, just kind of on the job, you become more racist or whatever. Well, because I was also noting your research on the base rate neglect. That is, intuitively, we tend to neglect what the background base rate is of something when we want to infer what a cause might be. We notice the handful of things that stand out, but we don't ask, well, what's the background rate? So here, something like, police killings. Well, why are there more police killings in inner cities? Because that's where there's more crime. And so, and then there's more, say, African Americans living in these inner cities. So you're going to have a spike in a kind of disproportionate asymmetry of the number of encounters between police and citizens in these inner cities, which happen to be populated in certain areas by African Americans. And then you have the availability heuristic. That's what makes everybody videotapes these things now, and that's what makes the news. We never see the 10 million. I think it's something like 50 million encounters between police and citizens every year, mostly just traffic stops and things like that, where nothing happens. And most police are good people; they're not racist, and so on. But I can see, if we neglect the base rate, what's the average encounters that happen, then we're going to get a distorted picture. And then, you can't help but watch videos like the George Floyd killing and be enraged about the police. I was. Everybody was. How could you not be? So it's hard to put that into perspective and treat it as a scientific question because it's such a politically charged issue.
Yeah. That was a truly amazing event. There's the reaction to it. I mean, millions and millions and millions of people pouring out in demonstrations about that. I mean, that's another optimistic thing on our recent horizon.
Yes. It could be that this is a triggering event. Same thing with the metoo movement to course correct. We have made a lot of progress. Most people are not racist, misogynist bigots anymore like they used to be, say, 50 years ago. Steve Pinker's fond of saying that conservatives today are more liberal than liberals were in the 1950s, at least socially. We have made a lot of progress, but clearly we haven't swept up everybody in the moral arc. And so there's still these outliers. So maybe this is another course correction. Like on the Me Too movement, I mean, all of us in academia have been through these training programs. I'm sure you've had to go through them too, like this is what you're not supposed to do. Don't sleep with the students. I got it. This used to go on all the time. I remember when I was in college, you could see it happening. And I remember even being, we had an attractive woman in our grad program, and the professors were interested in her. And I'm like, hey, come on, that's not fair. You have more power than us as lowly graduate students. What chance do we have, right? But I think that's largely been corrected, right? I think the training programs do make a difference.
Yeah, I have no idea, actually. I mean, I haven't gone through a training program like that. My friend Lee Ross did go through a sexual abuse program, and he said he hated the idea of having to go attend these classes. However, he had to admit they were acted out, and he said the actors were so funny and so interesting.
Oh my God!
It tended to drain his resentment over the thing. I worry a lot, however, about this Chinese Cultural Revolution thought correction sessions that go on.
On social media monitoring, you mean?
No. I mean, the university saying you have to go and learn to be devoted.
Education camp type thing. Yes, yes.
And I don't think. I think the best outcome there is that it doesn't actually do anything. But because what I fear is that people are, will recoil against it. And actually, I don't know. You probably read this event recently. The president of the University of Chicago had a speech on the immorality of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, in university campuses, and was going to give a talk on that at MIT. And the upshot was the president disinvited him from giving.
Really? Oh my God, I have not heard this. Wow.
Would have done that.
Yes.
Yeah, this is a problem. Well, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, universities are already amongst the most liberal, progressive, tolerant places on the planet.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, it's that's why I say you can only hope that there is no consequence of these programs, because any consequence is negative. It's not going to be positive because people are already doing what they ought to do. They're doing what any liberal or progressive would want them to be doing. I mean, this whole notion of didn't get off onto this, but the whole notion of institutional racism. Well, there's structural racism, but institutional racism in universities is hard to find. And if I said that, if I still were active in a university, I wouldn't have said what I just said, because I would be punished.
Yeah, well, here the criteria or the operational definition of what you're trying to measure is any outcome differences at all can only be explained as racism, misogyny, or bigotry in general. Again, neglecting the base rate. So why aren't there more female computer programmers at Google? I don't know. Maybe it is still in part an old boys environment. There's probably some of that. It's, we've heard stories about that. But what's the base rate of how many women are applying for Google computer programmer jobs? Is it 50-50? But through some discriminatory hiring practices, only 20% of the 50% of women are hired. Whatever, I'm just making these numbers up, but you get the idea. And we don't know, because we don't know what the base rate is. Google doesn't tell us, how many female applicants they get, I guess. And, without that, then you can't know what the cause is of the difference, the outcome difference.
Right. Yeah, we don't know the relative contributions of many, many plausible factors. But this tendency of people to say unequal outcomes must have to do, there has to be a villain there somewhere. And maybe so, but not necessarily the institutions which are sustaining these differences. We just don't know.
Right.
I think most people understand this. I have a very good friend who's Black, and he says, don't assume that the whole Black community is up in arms, seeing discrimination everywhere and so on. I says, so you sit in the barbershop, you have some guy say, this boss did this to me, this terrible thing, and somebody in the eye says, listen, Buster, you screwed up. That's why that happened to you. I think if more whites knew that the range of attitude on these questions for Blacks, it would be a good thing for us all to know that.
Yeah. Well, this is a point Jason Riley made to me on the show from the Wall Street Journal, that the early surveys show that most African Americans do not support critical race theory being taught in public schools, for example, or whatever you want to call it. They're claiming that that's not critical race theory. This is something else. Well, okay, whatever you call it, just assuming that, racism is structurally inherent in the entire country and that all of us are unconsciously racist, call it that, whatever you want, is not true. And most people don't think it's true, but it seems to be driven by academics and intellectuals who, have fingered that as the cause. So if there's, say, a difference in home ownership rates between Blacks and whites, well, that can only be because of discrimination and racism. But even if there's no more redlining and, most, real estate mortgage lenders are not racist, it's still built into the system because, going back decades or centuries and so on. Well, at that point, you're no longer talking about psychology. You're talking about what? Economics, or, how these kind of trends happen over long periods of time. Anyway, so I'm just kind of free associating there. So, Richard, let's wrap it up. I'm just, again, so honored to have you, a great mind on the show like this. I have one more question I have to ask you, because this issue always comes up about free will and determinism. How do you think about human volition, given that you've spent your whole life looking for what causes people to behave in a certain way? Are you a compatibilist, determinist? Are you a free willist? Or, how do you think about that issue?
Well, I try not to think about it, because every time I start thinking about that, I'm reminded of my skeptical friend in graduate school who says, hey, Dick, that's night school metaphysics. Stay away from that.
Yes. Night school metaphysics. I like that.
It's nevertheless about that. I mean, one thing that we didn't get onto at all is my discovery of, with Tim Wilson, of how easy it is to have people do things. You make them do things, and you then ask them why they did that. And what you get is confabulation. I mean, it's just, they make something up. I mean, and I now think, the iceberg analogy about how much of mental life is conscious and how much is unconscious is absolutely true, but it's even the right way to think about any given inference that we make. I mean, the things that go into there are much more unconscious stuff. I mean, if you have somebody vote in a school and you ask them to approve or disapprove of a new school millage, they're more likely to approve of the new millage than if you have them vote in a church. And if you have them vote in a church, they're more likely to vote against abortion than if you have them vote in a school. I mean, it just goes on like that forever. I mean, if you have them hold a pencil like this in their mouth versus like this, and have them rate jokes, they think the jokes are funnier when their mouth is put into this position and when their mouth is put into that position. It's just, I mean, psychologists by now have got a million of these. I mean, so, now.
Although I think some of those didn't survive the replication crisis too well. Some of that priming stuff is interesting. Some of it didn't replicate, so it remains to be seen. But your larger point is true. If you ask people why you did something, why are you a Catholic? Almost no one says, well, my parents were, and I just do, I was raised that way. No, they'll have arguments and reasons why, or if you say, why are you a Democrat or why are you a Republican? No one says, well, that was my culture, or my parents were Republicans, so I have to do that. No one says that. You.
But it's confabulation.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
It's all a welfare case. By the way, the replication thing, that's a whole huge topic, and we're not going to get into it now, I know, but I will tell you. And one of the things that was alleged not to replicate is this thing. Turns out all the people who were, quote, trying to replicate it did it with a video camera on the person, very prominent in the room. He's very well aware that he's being shown on a monitor. While doing that.
Interesting.
And
I did not know that.
Oh, interesting.
Right.
I did not
so
know
if
that.
you get rid of the camera, you get the effect.
Really?
And there was an awful lot of there was a huge amount of incompetence that went into that first report in Science by Nozick and his colleagues. About half of psychology studies don't replicate, and that's it was unbelievably incompetent. I mean, starting with the fact that most of the things were the experiments that were chosen because somebody suspected that effect was not real. They just didn't believe it. So now half of the studies that people tend not to believe don't replicate. Oh, that's interesting. It's not half of the studies out there. Anyway, I can go on forever on this topic.
I'm really glad to hear that, actually. I'm relieved to hear that because it was kind of depressing. Like, oh my God.
Okay, here's the single most important thing to remember about this replication crisis business. I started asking people when this came out, psychologists, to tell me any study they could recall when it came out. It seemed interesting and important. People knew about it, and then it failed to replicate. I have only to this point maybe a half dozen examples like that. There is not a replication crisis in psychology. There never has been. Important stuff tends to replicate. I mean, there are a few exceptions. The ego depletion stuff that you may know about. If you make me work very hard at doing something, strain the concentration, then I'm more likely to eat a plate of cookies. I mean, that's dubious apparently. But there's very little else other in the way of important phenomena that don't replicate.
That's a huge relief. That's kind of the revenge of the textbook. So if we read it in textbooks, it's probably been filtered enough that it's probably true.
That's right. Yeah, in my
Pinker has
textbook, we had to.
That's right. You have textbooks. Pinker has a quote in Rationality from some physicist. It was like Enrico Fermi, somebody big, who said that 90% of what's in physics textbooks is true, and 90% of what's in physics journals is false. So it's kind of the revenge of the textbooks that by the time it gets there, it has been replicated.
That's lovely. So who is that? Who said that?
I forget. I'll have to look it up. It's in Steve's new book, Rationality.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, that's a wonderful quote.
Well worth reading. All his books are well worth reading, as are yours. Also very important. And I'm relieved to hear that the replication, we can put that behind us. Good. The replication crisis has been debunked. That's really funny. Well, Richard, thank you so much for your work. And what's next? I can tell you're still mentally quite active. You must be working on some other projects and papers or whatever.
I am, and if I ever actually do it, I'll have to change my email address or possibly my physical address. It's what to do about the problem that we have, that different ethnic groups, different social groups are differently abled cognitively. I mean, it's we, in all public settings, we have to pretend, that it's there's no there, but there is. I'll give you one example of something. There's a paper that I have my name on unjustly because I really was not involved in it, but it's an extremely interesting study by a former student of mine, Michael Morris, who's a Columbia Business School professor, and his student, who is a Chinese-American professor at MIT, discovered that, I don't know if you've heard of the concept of the bamboo ceiling in corporations. That's Asians can only get so high and no higher.
Yes, yeah.
Bamboo ceiling.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it turns out that there is indeed a bamboo ceiling for East Asians. It's the opposite for South Asians. South Asians are more likely to be CEOs than whites.
Oh my God, I had no idea.
Yes.
Oh my God, I had no idea.
Yeah. So shall we assume it's prejudice against these East Asians? I don't doubt that some of it is properly regarded as prejudice, and I believe you could generate more equal outcomes there. I think there are things that can be said about that. And why do South Asians do so well? If you know many Southeast Asians, you may know some like I know they're just very assertive, not aggressive. I mean, they've got their opinions and they're going to tell you if they think you're wrong. And they're going to put out their ideas in a confident way and so on. All of this is, this is CEO stuff. And that's just not the Asian culture has, the concept, the empty wagon makes the most noise. The nail that sticks out will be hammered down. You get a culture who thinks that way, that's not a good training ground for. So there are all of these, cognitive skills related kinds of issues that need to be understood culturally, and where you find disadvantage, you need to understand the role that culture plays there because it can be combated to a degree. So anyway, that's the book I'm.
Yeah, that you should do that absolutely. These differences would. You assume would be largely cultural, environmental, not genetic.
There's no doubt about it. We didn't get onto the race issue, but the black-white difference in IQ, I am confident, owes nothing to genes. That psychologists could have believed that it did on the basis of the flimsiest evidence. You look at that evidence, you just give it a push and it collapses. Anyway, so I would be, I would feel quite innocent and worthy of admiration if I were to write a book like that, but I would minimally have to change my email address if I did write it.
Yes. Well, I suspect at this point in your career, Richard, you're beyond being canceled. You're not going to lose your job or livelihood or your reputation at this point.